And we have, again, 3 papers this session. Following the format of the previous panels, we'll have first the presentation of the papers with about 5 to 7 minutes for each presenter, and then following that, brief responses by the authors of about 3 to 5 minutes. And once everybody is settled in, I think we can get started, and then we'll open it up, of course, for general discussion.
Okay.
All right, if we're all settled in, then I will introduce our first author. This is Arvid Schors, who studies modern history and political science at the University of Freiburg in Germany and Durham University at the UK. He holds an MA from the University of Freiburg, where he's currently working on a PhD thesis in modern history about strategic arms limitation talks, SALT talks, between 1969 and 1979. His paper that we're discussing today is titled Substituting Trust to Convince Doubting Thomases, Trust and Mistrust, the Verification of the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks in the 1970s, and it will be presented by Jens Boysen.
Thank you very much. So you've already named the title. I don't have to read it again. It's very long. Don't know if it's the final title, but anyway. Okay, the author provides us with an interesting example for, on one hand, the complexity of trust as a policy resource with its rational and irrational elements, and on the other, for the sometimes peculiar ways in which the domestic and international level could be connected in the Cold War era. The example chosen here is the way in which various US administrations in the late 1960s and 1970s sought to secure for themselves a mandate for taking up negotiations with the Soviet Union over a reduction of strategic weapons, a step that, as we now know, would finally lead up to the SALT I treaty. The specific context of this initiative was that while it required, according not only to political theory but as well to the opinion of those having to lead the negotiations, a minimum of trust or confidence, we can discuss that later, building with the Soviet side. The domestic context in the USA at the time was hostile to the idea of such confidence building, or put in different words, would not hear about their representatives trusting the Soviet side. This made it necessary for the government, in order to get and sustain their negotiation mandate, to construct a strategy vis-à-vis the home front, as I call it here, that would seem and arguably was quite contradictory, but did effectively enable the US side to take up talks. That strategy consisted in reassuring the domestic public, that is essentially Congress and the media, that the planned negotiations would be conducted on the basis of a deliberate policy of distrust towards the Soviet side. So rather than promising, as would be usual business, I could say, to build confidence with the other side as a framework or basis for successful negotiations, they promised that cooperation, as they called it, and ultimately achieving results was possible without trust, and suggested that it could be substituted for by verification technologies such as satellite surveillance as so-called national means of verification. That term is very important, national means of verification. This suggested the possibility of an independent unilateral way of controlling the global security situation without building trust. Even though military and technology experts made it clear that any complete verification could not be achieved this way, the administrations kept insisting towards the public that it could, and that trust, therefore, was not needed. Together with the emotional hostility, to get to the emotional aspects, underlying the whole discourse at the home front, one can say that an explicit confirmation of distrust towards the Soviet adversary became a major precondition for the administration being entrusted by the home front with a mandate for negotiation. So we have 2 levels here where trust building was needed or not. Arvid quotes here the very telling term of a credibility ritual that had to be performed by government officials, stating that they would under no circumstances trust the adversary. To better understand the reasoning behind that approach, one has to go back even one step further and see that the primary initiative towards strategic arms talks was taken up by Nixon and Kissinger, not in a spirit of what we know as détente, but rather out of desperation about the loss of nuclear superiority in the 1960s and the wish to somehow regain it, so to speak, through the back door, by negotiating with the enemy, in order to establish a common regime that would, however, allow the USA to regain national control of the global situation. This way, the actual intention here was to maintain or re-establish, rather than overcome, the unilateral security thinking of the 1950s. In this context, Arvid speaks of an attempt of finding an intellectual backdoor to escape from the existential implications of a nuclear age. This would relate to what used to be called the theology of the nuclear arms race, that is, the fact that the imminent threat of ultimate destruction forced politicians, or at least some of them, to rethink the basics of international relations in those days. Kissinger is one example. In a speech before Congress in 1972, contrasted trust with the enlightened self-interest of both sides and suggested that the negotiations be firmly guided by the latter. However, while this being an explicit refusal of trust as a foreign policy concept, this might also be interpreted as a way to seek a common interest with the adversary without calling it that way, in order to keep the trust at the home front. So, there was on one hand a rational consideration, even if inspired by unilateral long-term goals of power, that talks with the Soviet Union were necessary, and on the other hand, the irrational/emotional exclusion of trust in that opponent. It was indeed spoken, that is a quotation from Arvid's text, of the danger that some kind of trust between the superpowers could emerge. So trust seen as a danger. It would be interpreted not as an opportunity to build confidence, but as an entry gate for the enemy with whom no real community of interest seemed possible, and thus the danger to lose one's own point and one's own vested national interests. In reality, however, once the SALT negotiations were taken up, the US and Soviet negotiators did begin to build trust between them through the common experience of meetings, talking, and getting to know each other. Only, as it seems, at least the Americans, about the Soviets I don't know, they could not tell about this at home, but rather had to maintain that they were negotiating without trust, in the awareness of their country's capacity to verify unilaterally Soviet compliance. Still, there were later made attempts at reconciling the public expectation for national verification with a need to inform about practical achievements from the SALT negotiations. Example given in 1975, the Ford administration sent a paper to some members of Congress in which they stated a, on the whole, satisfactory compliance regime on the Soviet side. During the further development of that policy in the 1970s could be observed a mixed pattern of argument brought forward by the government, whatever government that was, including elements of both the principle of distrust that had to be applied, at least rhetorically, and the pragmatic approach taken at the negotiation table where the home front couldn't see them, so to speak. The latter element would inevitably reintegrate a certain minimum of trust, despite all assurances to the opposite. And despite the later failure of SALT II, that approach would be resumed in the late 1980s. So one could say that the original idea, harbored by Nixon and Kissinger, of regaining superiority through the back door had turned into trust sneaking back into US foreign policy through the back door by the sheer power of reality. In his paper, Arvid combines in an alternating way his empirical findings with theoretical reflection. This way he contributes, as I find very well, to the theoretical discussion that was at the heart of this conference. In particular, he emphasizes a described contradictory, or as he calls it, hypocritical approach, as it resulted from the US domestic context, as well as from the unilateral preoccupation of the administrations. In brackets, myself, I would even suggest speaking of a certain policy schizophrenia in a similar way as I do with respect to the GDR. Brackets. In his reconstruction, Arvid draws especially on Ute Frewert's concept of trust as a condition being shaped by both rational and irrational factors. At the same time, he explains, again as I find very convincingly, that despite this insufficient theoretical basis for policy making, political reality, or life if you want, proved to be more flexible and inventive and allow for some practical implementation. As a result, it seems the very lack of theoretical clarity opened up a path for real-life solutions that were beyond the abstract or illusionary discourse of US domestic policy. And as a last word for interpretation, this contradictory or even schizophrenic, as I call it, developments and conditions described here is something that one could call either the fuzzy logic of reality, or, as an historian, simply the openness of the historical process. In other words, to the historian, it seems clear that nobody at any time is able to control all factors in international relations, including the adversary, but in fact, during that time of office, there visibly exists a strong wish on the part of politicians to exert such control, only the outcome cannot be predicted. Thank you.
I wasn't here for the first panel, so I don't know what to mention. Thank you very much anyways. The second paper to be discussed has two authors, and I will introduce them both briefly. The first author is Laura Considine. She's a PhD candidate in the International Politics Department at Aberystwyth University, where she's researching the role of trust and mistrust in US, Soviet, or Russian strategic nuclear arms control treaties from 1985 to 2010. She has a master's degree in security studies from the University of St. Andrews and is currently a British Research Council Fellow at the Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. Her research interests include nuclear arms control and disarmament issues, the politics of nuclear weapons and international order, and the issues of trust in international relations. The second author is Nicholas Wheeler, who is currently a professor in the Department of International Politics at Aberystwyth University. His publications include a book with Ken Booth, The Security Dilemma, Fear, Cooperation, and Trust in World Politics, which came out with Palgrave in 2008, an edited volume with Jean-Marc Coicot, National Interest versus Solidarity, Particular and Universal Ethics in International Life, which came out in 2008 with the United Nations University Press, a book with Ian Clarke, The British Origins of Nuclear Strategy, 1945 to 1955, which appeared with Oxford University Press. And he has also written widely on humanitarian intervention and is the author of Saving Strangers, Humanitarian Intervention in International Society, which came out with Oxford in 2000. He's currently researching a book provisionally entitled Trusting the Enemy as part of a 3-year AHRC fellowship on the challenges to trust building in nuclear worlds as part of RC UK's Global Uncertainties, Security for All in a Changing World program. He is co-editor with Professor Christian Ruiz-Smith of the prestigious Cambridge Series in International Relations. From February 2012, he will be taking up a new post as director of the Center for Global Cooperation and Security, which is being established at the University of Birmingham. Now, their paper today is entitled Reagan May Have Had Trust in Gorbachev, but the United States demanded verification of the Soviet Union, Lessons from the Making of the INF Treaty, and it will be presented by Emmanuel Moulin-Doual.
So that's a paper that I greatly enjoyed, found very convincing, extremely solid, extremely agreeable to read. And I'll just quickly outline what the number of points that I found central. The number of points that I found central to the analysis, and then just sketch out a few points for discussion. So your basic central question is to examine the causal relationship between verification and trust, because of course the assumption of the sentence "trust but verifies" that there is an opposition between trust and verification. In order to explain this, you outline two approaches. One would be to see an inverse relationship. Verification is a substitute for trust. To simplify, the more you verify, the less you trust. And the second approach would be, by contrast, to say that actually accepting to verify is in itself an act of trust. And then you explain this with the example of Gorbachev and Reagan and the INF Treaty. And indeed, as you explained, part of Gorbachev's new thinking was precisely that verification, even if highly intrusive, perhaps because it is highly intrusive, was part of the process of building trust. Then you provide the definition of trust, explaining that the litmus test of whether actors actually believe that trust exists in a relationship is indeed the willingness to take on new vulnerabilities. So here again, you see two steps. One is establishing mistrust, reducing actions, and the second one is the willingness to accept new vulnerabilities. And particularly, as you explained, the case of Gorbachev and Reagan, which I found very interesting, is the willingness to accept new vulnerabilities without reciprocation. And here you explained that the key, according to you, was Gorbachev's perception of Reagan, that Gorbachev's perception of Reagan trustworthiness had changed. Particularly, you explain how it changed through two meetings, Geneva, November 85, and then Reykjavik in October 86. So this is very quickly the main points. On different issues that you raised during the paper, one first question that I had was you talk about the impact of Chernobyl. So happening in the middle between the two summits. Do you have what is key in reinforcing Gorbachev's beliefs? You explained that Chernobyl was kind of the event which confirmed his thinking that new steps ought to be taken. But to what extent did it really matter for Gorbachev? Put it differently, would Gorbachev's strategy have failed had Chernobyl not happened? Was it really the key moment? Because you explained that he was more and more convinced of the strategy of accepting new vulnerabilities, and then Chernobyl happens, and it's a confirmation. But did he really need a confirmation? I mean, what would have happened without the confirmation? A second issue, which is pushing you a bit the outside of Reagan or Gorbachev, and this is actually an interesting point. The two papers by Joseph Harahan and this one are very nicely complementary. One looking more at top level, and then the other looking more at the civil servant, the aides. Actually, I was wondering what was the role that you would attribute to other personalities? At some point in the paper, you do mention the inner circle of Reagan or the closest aide of Gorbachev. I see the focus of the article on Reagan or Gorbachev, but do you think that you're not mentioning them because it was really secondary, or didn't it matter at all in the formation of the trust, in the formation of the strategy of Gorbachev? Was he advised by his advisors precisely to change his thinking about the United States? A third point relates to the sources you use. So wouldn't it be worth looking, or trying to look, because I don't know if they are available, at other archival documents than the one you mentioned, precisely to try to trace back the thinking in the own administration beyond Reagan and Gorbachev? And the fourth point is linked to something you allude to at the end, when you say that Reagan may have had trust in Gorbachev, but the United States demanded verification of the Soviet Union. Could you elaborate a bit on this? I see that you're playing on the fact that trust is interpersonal, while verification is probably a question between two different states or their administration. A point which I find very interesting, but would you generalize it a bit? Could we just argue that indeed trust is just a question of persons, and that because it's a question of verifying armaments program, it goes beyond just personal relationships and relates to traditional governmental structures or administrations more generally? So that's it.
What was your third one?
The third one, the sources.
Sources. Okay.
Thank you very much. The third author of the final paper in this panel is Joseph Harahan. He's a public historian with the U.S. Department of Defense. He's a research historian with several arms control and arms reduction agencies, special assistant to the Chief of Air Force History, staff historian, Strategic Air Command. He researched, wrote, and edited and published 13 books, including histories of the INF Treaty, CFE Treaty, and forthcoming the Non-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, 1992 to 2008. His current research interest is researching a comparative history of national expectations at the end of the Cold War. His paper is entitled Building Confidence and Trust Between the United States and the Soviet Union During Implementation of the INF Treaty, and will be presented by Noël Bonhomme.
Thank you. This paper is very convincing, very strong, and as said Emmanuel, it completes very well the previous presentations because it does not deal with the signature and the bargaining of the INF Treaty at the political level, but with the practical implementation of the treaty at the technical level by military responsible on the implementation. So it is focused on the months following the signature in December 1987, describing the successful organization of the first inspections on site, which aimed to monitor the implementation of the treaty. These inspections on site were a new and huge concession from the Soviet Union, and the success of the treaty depended, therefore, on the way it would be applied by both sides, especially by the military authorities. So the argument, the point of the paper is that the trust at highest level between Reagan and Gorbachev is not sufficient to explain the success of the INF Treaty. We have to integrate the technical and namely military actors in the process of trust building, which explains the political dynamics leading to the other reductions arms treaty in the beginning of the 90s, especially the START treaty. So it proposed a quite different interpretation of the quote of Reagan, trust but verify. The argument is that there is trust because we verify, and the process of verification is, in a certain sort, an achievement of the trust process. So, according to Professor Hahn, the two kinds of trust explained the success by the two military responsible in charge of the implementation, General Roland Lajoie on the American side and General Vladimir Medvedev on the Soviet side. On one end, the military responsible chosen in Soviet Union and in United States, they knew each other, and the responsible that they choose for the inspection team knew each other all. So there was a kind of knowledge of familiarity among this inspection team. And these teams of inspection worked without passion, and they created a method of implementation of the treaty, which was new. This is for the trust between US and Soviet. From an inside point of view, each responsible explained the implementation of the treaty to the political authorities, to the public opinion, in the press, in the Congress, for example, in the United States. But on another side, this responsible let a large autonomy to the inspection teams. So they trust the responsible of the teams which lead inspection on the site. In order to avoid the procedural and bureaucratic lengths and to consolidate the atmosphere of trust created by the signature of the treaty. So a few questions about this original and very convincing paper. First, the link between trust at the level of decision makers and at the level of the military responsible of implementation. Basically, the INF Treaty was a novelty not only because it was the first arms reduction treaty, but also because for the first time, US and Soviets really agreed on the objective of the arms control. So what strikes me in your paper is the absence of calculation, no incidents, no issues other than technical issues. There is a real agreement, not a simple compromise between the two parties. So my question is, the trust built at the technical level the simple consequence of the political agreement at highest level, or is there two separated processes of building trust? So this is the first question. Second question, the sources. You use mainly press and a set of oral testimony from the two generals, General Medvedev and General Lajoie. Is there archives about these inspections, and would it reveal some difficulties between the Soviet and the American side inside each country? Indeed, you talk about the debates in the Congress during the ratification of the treaty, and on the Soviet side, it's quite surprising to not see any resistance if we think about the strong conservative forces opposite to Gorbachev in these years. And it leads to a third question about the media. Your paper is broadly convincing, as I said, but when you quote the declaration of Lajoie or Medvedev in the newspapers, I am not sure that it's an evidence of the trust relationship between the military teams. I think it rather demonstrates the willingness on the both sides to present the INF Treaty as a success to the public opinion. Is there declarations from the both sides the real proof of the trust? I'm not sure. And fourth and last questions, the links with the START negotiation. In your conclusion, you notice, and it's very interesting, that 3 experienced INF Treaty team chiefs were sent to Geneva to advise the American negotiators working on the START Treaty inspection protocols. And the Soviets make the same thing on their side. So do you notice a different approach between the military and the diplomat actor, or is it a broad process of trust building in the START negotiation? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Just, I must apologize. I realized I didn't pose questions to my partner, so could I just do that? Because he's anyway the first one who has to talk very shortly.
The best moment to do so, yeah.
Because I won't so agree with him, but just 2 things. At one point you mentioned that, or you asking the question, it's difficult to tell what the administration members at some point really thought themselves between what they told Congress, the fact they had to maintain this distrust discourse, and at the same time negotiating in real life on the other side. And is there any way to verify what certain, let's say, eminent members of some given administration actually thought? Is there any? Is that put down in some, I don't know, memorials or whatever? The other side is negotiators who were, as I said, did negotiate as usual, unobserved in a sense. So and I was suggesting that in a way that's enabled them to kind of maintain this, I wouldn't say double play, but say that they did something, had to report something quite different. Is that the right interpretation on my side? How did communication work between the negotiators and when they were briefing the people who then had to go to speak to Congress? So how did this work? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I will start. Thank you very much for your, I think, quite accurate and helpful commentary. I will start with these two questions and then try to talk about the implicit questions you were asking before. First of all, about what did the leaders or like the head of government. Good sign? Bad sign? Good. Yeah, what did they thought themselves, or like what did Carter thought? First of all, I have to say, I mean, I cover a lot of ground there. What you have to do is like contextualize every administration and say what are the circumstances. But in general, I would say, yeah, you can see what they thought because they were talking about what they did to each other. To, for example, Carter or like and Nixon and Kissinger were talking all the time what they really thought. So you can see that there is a big gap between sometimes what they were saying and what they really were thinking. But you had to go into each administration to really show where are the differences. At the same time, and it's also like, I mean, in the case of Carter, you can see that he really wanted to have this treaty, He was haggling with how to communicate this to the public in this changing like atmosphere, and the mistakes he did too. Yeah. The second question about this kind of double play, or is there a kind of double play between the negotiators and what the public? I mean, how did they communicate? The first thing is they. I don't think that these negotiations were kind of like that there was no connection to like the public discourse or something like this. There was a big connection. Of course, they could say different things on the negotiation table, and they could like separate each other and could say, okay, look, for example, the American negotiators could say, okay, look, you know how our system works. Everybody's talking all the time, so don't take this too seriously. We are still on board, and don't believe what like the New York Times writes about what we really think and all this stuff. But you see the like how much influence the public had even on these negotiations. And oftentimes, I mean, what's important about SALT is that there is no like usual briefing. These delegations were sitting in Helsinki, Vienna, and Geneva later on, and they didn't brief the press, because at the beginning there was a lot of press there because they wanted to have statements, but both sides agreed that they want just like give a communique, but the rest, and this was in a way a kind of confidence building measure, that they could assure this, that they, at the beginning they said, we do this, we don't speak to the press, that's really professional negotiation, and this worked, and this was seen as a sign. The Soviets said this several times, like, okay, we really are able to negotiate here without somebody is leaking all the time from our delegation, and this was a kind of a trust-building measure in this way. So that's to these 2 points. First of all, I wanted to say, again, stressing that as you accurately pointed out, what I wanted to do is like show that there are 2 levels of trust in a way. There's the public discussions, about trust or mistrust, and what's happening at the negotiation table. I mean, in the light of our discussions the last days, we could argue about, is this what's happening at the negotiation table? Is this trust or confidence or something in between? Because I'm still thinking about this. I'm sure that there is something happening there. I don't know if it's trust. I don't know if it's confidence. I don't know what it really is. But there is something changing between these negotiators over time on several levels, not only between the delegations, but also between, say, Kissinger and Dobrynin, between Nixon and Brezhnev, between Ford and Brezhnev, and all. There is something happening between these people, because they're sitting there and talking about this stuff, and there develops something. And what I found like analytically more striking is, if you look, I mean, I'm still at unease with this kind of, is this trust? I have to think about this a lot and what to do with it. But I found more striking to use it as like a term from the sources, because they were talking about trust and how the public and the people try to use trust and use it as a strategy, as a kind of ritual not to trust, and all these things. I think that's what I would rely on firstly, and then in the second step try to figure out what's happening between the negotiators. And that's also probably one point that comes together with this kind of development between the negotiators. I think Jeffrey Herf isn't there anymore, but he said at the beginning something, I think at the panel with Ute Frevert, that he thinks that both sides from the beginning and did know that they were in the same world and were kind of realists. And I absolutely disagree, because what you really can see is that, I mean, the Soviet Union was for the US and vice versa, like really, they didn't think they are rational. If you, just one example from the Soviet Union is, I mean, the Americans did use the nuclear bombs, and this was really something, we always forget this, and the Americans too forget this, because they say, we're the good guys. But for the Soviet, it was in a way inevitable that the Americans would probably use nuclear weapons again, and this persisted a long time, even in the 70s, this was still there. And they just had to come to some kind of mutual understanding that they are in the same world. And if you look at SALT at the beginning in '69, this wasn't there. I mean, this was really not there, and it was striking for the American negotiators that the Soviets were would talk about the ABM, this missile defense system, that they could negotiate about it at all, because in '67 the Soviets said at Glassboro at the summit that ABM is a defensive measure and that's it. But in the logic of deterrence, and we have to be clear here, deterrence is an idea. A defensive system can be offensive in the logic, and that the Soviets did suddenly change their minds there and say, okay, we could get rid of ABM because we see this kind of logical thing was a big revelation and was one of the biggest steps that they could try to come at least in some kind of same world. And this is what I think happens in a lot of places at a lot of times during the SALT negotiations all the time. And I don't know if it's trust, but it's something really important, and we have to think about what it is and how you conceptualize it. But it's really something quite important. It's a long process, but it's there and it stays even in the 80s. It's not like these experiences they had personally. It's still there, and it's some kind of ground, the common ground they can go back to in a way. Then just one thing about the Soviets, I think, just to make this clear, because I think implicitly you said this. I mean, I couldn't talk too much about the Soviets. I just wanted to say, for the Soviet side, verification was a little bit, I think, less important for several reasons. They had no, I mean, there was some kind of public even there, but it was not this pressuring for legitimacy. Second, there was a big asymmetry between the two sides, because on the one hand, they could use the American public discourse, could read the New York Times, they could go to Congress, so they had here an advantage to know what was going on the U.S. side, and the Americans did see this as a quite big problem for them. I think I stuck with this. Thank you very much.
Who wants to? I'm going to. Thanks. Well, thank you for your comments on behalf of both of us. And let me just respond briefly to the points you raised. I mean, I think you gave a very fair and very, very good overview of the paper, and captured what we were trying to argue about, this fundamental problem of the way in which these terms trust and verification are framed together, and whether ultimately, in this particular case that we're looking at, actually you can't really talk about trust but verify, because the verification story is also part of the trust story. But we wouldn't want to be read as arguing that there aren't other cases where trust but verify might actually be very relevant. And I think the Salt case might well be one which is much closer to that kind of paradigmatic position, if you want, because verification was, I think, very much a substitute for trust, and that's with the tension that you're kind of opening up there. So I think the two cases here raise interesting questions about just how we see that relationship. What we wanted to argue was that in the context of INF, which is, of course, where it got its most popular framing, it's a problematic proposition because the verify bit can't be seen independently of the trust bit. And I think that's the key point, which is where the on-site inspections comes in,
right,
and the vulnerability. And I'll say another. So you raised 4 questions for us to think about. Let me just canter through them. Chernobyl. I mean, I think I would say that without. I mean, this is a counterfactual, isn't it? If we run the tape again without Chernobyl, do we get the same kind of outcomes? I think my answer would be broadly yes. I mean, there might be slightly different paths that some things would go down, but I don't think Chernobyl is a fundamental game changer in the sense that if it wasn't there, the trajectory of new thinking and the changes that were to come wouldn't have taken place. That said, I think it was an incredibly sobering moment for the Soviet leadership and for Gorbachev. I mean, both in terms of realizing the importance of perestroika, transparency, the need to be much more open about these things within the Soviet Union, so that process. Also, I think it brought home to the new thinkers around Gorbachev and Gorbachev himself, and I think the military as well, just what the consequences of conventional war could look like in Europe. That if there was to be even a conventional war in Europe, nuclear power stations being destroyed in that way, the kind of consequences. So I think it brought home the importance of trying to find a new way. And the quote we have in the paper where Gorbachev talks about the need to break the old cycle of mistrust and suspicion, and the need for an instinctive leap, according to Velikov, came out of that. I think that's very important. On the role of advisors, yeah, I think we probably underestimate the role that they played. We've discussed a number of them. Jack Matlock, you mentioned yesterday, very, very important, clearly. That we could have done more, I think, with the Schultz-Shevardnadze relationship. I think that's also very important. And I think that brings us to your third point, really, about sources. I think one of the things we want to do with the revised version of the paper thicken up the documentary story, because that's clearly not as strong as it needs to be to sustain some of the claims we want to make. And I think that's particularly the case in relation to our claims about vulnerability. I think we need to do more to make that argument. We've got something in the paper to support those claims, but I think we could do with more, and hopefully Laura, when she's out here for the next few months, is going to find more information to support that. And then your final question, which I think is kind of does go to the heart of a lot of what we've been discussing the last couple of days, in terms of our title. Yeah, I mean, in a sense, what our title is doing is really sort of anticipating what Uche Favorite was going to say to us in the lecture, which is that you can only really talk about trust in relation to the interpersonal, because we're saying that Reagan might have trusted Gorbachev, and that interpersonal relationship was one in which Reagan was prepared to do things that he wouldn't have done without that relationship, and vice versa. But both of the leaders knew, and this comes back to the point about SALT, I think, that if their countries were to sign agreements, there would have to be verification provisions that could be saleable. And so in a sense, and I think you picked this point up really nicely at the end, that verification is something that's done between states. And in that sense, it's like confidence, and it's a form of confidence, clearly. So confidence and verification belong to that question of between states. Trusting relationships, is that then in the realm of the interpersonal? And I suppose our paper plays on that. And it seems to me that does really raise what I think has been a central issue over the last couple of days, which is a lot of the debate is kind of, we've moved between the argument that you can apply the concept of trust to collective institutions, and that is an applicable way to use it on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's been the argument, well, actually, no, you shouldn't really use the language of trust when you're talking about collective institutions. You should only use it when you're talking about interpersonal relationships, and relationships which embody the properties that Uche Favorite was talking about the other night, and others. So I think, in a sense, that brings us back really to the central question, which I think we probably need to get some kind of at least purchase on this morning, if I can say that to the organisers. But there is one other way in which I think our paper title can be read, and this is my last point, which is that I think it was also an attempt to play on the concept that is used a lot in debates in realist international relations theory, and particularly amongst students of the security dilemma, which is this notion of what's called the future uncertainty problem. And the future uncertainty problem fundamentally is that I may have confidence today in the motives and intentions of another state, but how can I be sure that in the future another leadership might not come to power, another group might not come to power with a different set of motives and intentions? So even if Reagan and Gorbachev had this really close interpersonal relationship, even if they were prepared to sign up to lots and lots of things that no leaders before of the United States and the Soviet Union were prepared to sign up to, there was always the question for both of them how they would legitimate those kind of deals and agreements to the home front, to use your term, knowing that in the future circumstances might change. And I think that's a real challenge for building trust in international relations, because it's not enough just to be confident in the present. You need to be confident that in the future, particularly in the nuclear sphere, where the lead times for capabilities are so large, that is going to continue on. And I think that's a major challenge for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Laura, would you like to add? Okay. And now, that's on to Jessica.
Unlike other scholars here, I am not a professor. I am not a teacher. I was a public historian working in a Department of Defense agency that carried out the inspections under the INF Treaty, and the CFE Treaty, and the START Treaty, and the Open Skies Treaty, and the Chemical Weapons Treaty as well. I went on 15 or 16 inspections in the Soviet Union, Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and so on. And I researched through interviews, archival sources, governmental sources, and so on, and wrote and published 2 books on these treaties. The first point I want to make is that I relied on Deborah Larson's point about the American government being a pluralistic system, one with numerous power centers. And that means when a new technical agreement comes along, such as the INF Treaty, that the representatives of the government must go to Congress and must testify to this agreement, to this treaty. They must go to the Senate. And department secretaries, senior diplomats, military officials, national security officials, all had to testify before Congress and such. But they didn't really know much about the INF Treaty. And so the question is, how did they get an expertise? How did they come to the conclusion? And there, they came to General LaJoy, the director of the agency, and he briefed the Secretary of Defense every other week for like 5 months. And that's extraordinarily unusual in the Department of Defense, that level of access that you have to the Secretary of Defense. He briefed the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He briefed the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, and so on. And always the question is, are you prepared to carry out this treaty? And he would explain the negotiations they'd had to that point. There were 3 negotiations with Soviet on-site inspection leaders. And he would explain what the process was for training, recruitment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he always incorporated the latest information. He briefed senior officials at the State Department, at the National Security Agency, at the CIA, and so on. And all of this raised the level of knowledge about the treaty itself, and it became part of this consensus for ratification of the treaty in May of 1988. So consequently, it was of interest as to how the treaty was going to work. How was it going to be carried out? Was it going to be successful or not? Because there were questions. The conservative Republican right questioned the entire treaty. They wanted to know about verification. They wanted to know about these inspections. They wanted to know how intrusive they were, and so on. There was little interest, except in the military, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, about the United States commands, the United States weapons that would be inspected. It was mostly all concerning the Soviets on that side. So consequently, when the inspections began to take place in July of 1988, there was intense interest in the media. All of the major networks led with the story of the INF Treaty and the inspections. ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, PBS, BBC, German networks all led with what was going on. In addition, there were national, local, and foreign press: New York Times, Post, the Washington Times, Christian Science Monitor, Los Angeles Times, London Times, Pravda, Time, Newsweek, and so on. All of these were intensely interested in the inspection aspect or the verification aspect of carrying out this specific treaty. And so it's elevated from being a small technical treaty with certain inequities and eliminations and so on to be a major test of international relations between these two states. And what happened was that they had deliberately, in the negotiating the treaty, had said that there would be what they called baseline inspections, and the baseline inspections would be to go to every single site in the first 90 days in both nations. There were 31 sites in the United States and 115 sites in the Soviet Union. I say United States, but it also was in Germany, it was in the Netherlands, it was in Italy, and in Belgium. And so all of these inspections were carried out within not 90 days, but 60 days. And the media policy was to allow the inspection team chiefs to be interviewed at the first inspection. During the first wave of inspections, they could all be interviewed and discuss issues and so on. And that meant that the public knew of this, what was happening, as well as the national leaders knew what was happening there. The questions were asked about the agreement. Was it just a technical agreement? I think it was a small technical agreement compared to START treaty later on and other treaties. But it became elevated by the media and by the consensus in the American system of government, and perhaps in the Soviet as well. Sources, there are congressional sources. I used those books I wrote and so on. And on the Soviet side, they were in their Duma. They did hold hearings and so on. But the two systems are not different. Same. They're not the same. The Soviet system is quite different there. And the link to the START treaty, it was there. There was no really difference between the diplomats and the military. The diplomats deferred to the military who had recent experience in this area and just accepted their expertise. That's it.
Hey, thank you very much, and thank you very much to all the panelists. We have now, I think, well over an hour even for questions. And half an hour?
I'll think of coffee.
Keep them brief.
Think of coffee first.
So, floor is open. Please.
Thank you. Thanks. I enjoyed all the papers. I would strongly encourage all 3-4 authors. There's a wealth of archival material, documentary material that's available now at the National Security Archive on the subjects that are covered in this session. We actually have far more material available on this part of history than on earlier phases. Over at the National Security Archive, there are huge collections that really should inform your papers, both for the American side and for the top levels down to the working levels. And I think you could do a lot more with the papers using these materials. And there's, in fact, the National Security Archive also has Russian documents. For example, we have the diary of Svetlana Savranskaya has the diary of Anatoly Cherняев. So to get closer into Gorbachev's, the other side's thinking, you have a key source there that's available, and that I would encourage you to use to give your papers a much more exhaustive documentary basis. Thank you.
Good suggestion.
Yeah, I'm actually starting there next week with Svetlana to do some research. So we're going to start that shortly.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think Nick raised two fundamental questions. Is trust limited to personal relationships, and the future uncertainty problem? And going to the first question, I think we need to distinguish between trust between people, on a personal level, and trust in people when they are acting in a role on behalf of the state. In other words, this isn't just trusting someone to return a dinner invitation. I mean, when Reagan and Gorbachev are negotiating with each other, they are in their role as leaders of governments. And so maybe that's the way of, getting at this problem, institutions versus personal. I mean, you could trust someone on a personal level, but not trust them in their role because you know that they can't deliver the government. Maybe they can't deliver the parliament. And the second question on the future uncertainty problem, maybe that goes to the difference between informal agreements and treaties. And with treaties and executive agreements, there's some continuity between individual leaders that isn't there, with just personal relationships. I mean, granted, they aren't enforceable, but a treaty does have a substantial legitimacy and their cost to disobeying it. And there's a lot of literature on compliance with agreements.
Yeah. Are you grouping them, or are we responding as we go along?
I think we're responding as we go along.
Okay. Do you want to take this? Debbie, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I suppose the question is, how far do these roles of leaders enable and constrain them in the kind of moving in a how do they take an interpersonal trusting relationship with another leader, like the one that Reagan and Gorbachev seem to have developed? How does that then get played politically back into each of their respective domestic political situations? And the notion in the sense of them being constrained by the role, but also enabled by the role, might be one way of thinking about this. I mean, some of the theoretical research on roles and institutions uses this notion of enabling and constraining. And then you could look at the conditions under which these leadership roles enable new possibilities that previously were closed off, but which the interpersonal dimension opens up because people start to develop a new trustworthiness in the possibilities of working with the other. But also how constrained it is. I mean, my work on the India-Pakistan situation is a quite interesting case here, because if you look at the Lahore peace process, I think Atal Bihari Vajpayee, the Indian Prime Minister, and Nazar Sharif, the Pakistani Prime Minister, developed a good personal relationship, but Nazar Sharif could not make it stick domestically, and the Indians were, not sure at the beginning of this process whether Nazar Sharif would be able to make it stick, but they took the view that they didn't really have much alternative if they wanted to build peace with Pakistan, but they got themselves into a process where they then started to have somewhat hopeful expectations that Nazar Sharif would be able to make it stick, but he couldn't. And then, of course, the Indians had a real shock when the Pakistani military subverted the enterprise, arguably, and started a war in the Himalayas, which, could have escalated to a nuclear confrontation. So that's an interesting one, I think, where your point about leaders being able to, in a role, Nazar Sharif wanted, I think, to cooperate and to do more with India, but he was really constrained. So then so the relationship between the interpersonal trusting relationship of these leaders and their ability to actually make agreements and make things stick, I think is what I think that's the point you open up there. And the future uncertainty point, I think, is well taken. But
I think that's quite an interesting, probably, backdoor we could use and quite helpful. Probably that's a help to come out of this dilemma. But then there's the question where we draw the line between these personal trust and personal level of trust and the role as a representative. Because in my case, it's oftentimes between the delegations, especially if they say, okay, now between the head of delegations, we go off record now. That's really a personal, informal meeting now. They both are alert that this means, okay, we're really talking now in a way as representatives for our states, because nothing is not political or not important. If you look what kind of memcons the American side, for example, sends back to Washington, I mean, they are always every discussion they have, even the most profane and non-substantial talks, they send back because they really try to analyze everything. So the question is, even if they, like Semenyov and Smith, just talking on the bar about philosophical context, even there they try, and especially, Semenov used oftentimes quoting the Bible and something and said to Smith, okay, there's a hint in there, I cannot say where, but you will figure it out, this kind of, no, it's no joke, and Smith did understand and could sometimes figure it out. On the other hand, the later chief negotiator Johnson, who had also to deal with Semenov, had no clue about this. He really had problems. He said, this guy's talking about the Bible and the Quran, and I don't get it. So, but this means everything is they act as representatives, even if they're really talking about life and things. And so, how do we deal with this, and where draw the line?
Thanks. I have a couple of questions, big thematic questions for all four authors here. The first has to do with technology and the extent to which technology, changing technology, can serve as a substitute for bilateral agreements, trust, confidence, and so on. Think back to some of the great episodes in the Cold War, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, that was triggered by the use of technology. Think about Eisenhower's Open Skies proposal, which is an attempt to use technology as a way of building trust and confidence. The unilateral use of technology, use of it by one side to inspect the other. In subsequent eras, of course, subsequent periods, satellites could have played this same role. So I'd be curious to hear your comments on whether technology was thought of as a substitute, as a complement, how that figures into this process of trust building. My second question addresses, I think, a fundamental asymmetry between the two sides in the Cold War. When we talk about bilateral agreements being reached, there's a certain assumption of symmetry. In other words, the two countries are equal partners in the agreement. And that's true in a legal diplomatic sense, but of course the fundamental background asymmetry, when you're talking about trust and confidence, is the fact that the United States was an open society and the Soviet Union was a closed society. And this, I think, had profound implications for intelligence gathering, for trust building, confidence, what each side could know about the other. So I'd be very curious to know whether this fundamental asymmetry factored in at all into the negotiations that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think, first of all, to the asymmetry, I think we talked about this personally, but that's very interesting and also a important factor for both sides, because on the one hand, the Soviets could use the democratic system against the US all the time because they knew so much about like what's going on in Congress, about the media. So it was a big disadvantage. There comes also the question of continuity, because I mean, democratic systems change their leaders all the time. They change delegations and experts more often than the Soviets. The Salt delegation between 69 and 79 on the Soviet side didn't change almost no personnel. I mean, just Semenov was there till 78, and most of the his experts were also there. But on the American side, they had changed all the time because of political disturbances, and that was a disadvantage. And a lot of like American negotiators did criticize this, that they don't have the continuity there, and they are like in the defense because of that. On the other side, the Americans could use, for example, the public and Congress to wage the Cold War in another way. So it was also some kind of weird advantage, because they could say, okay, look, I mean, we understand your point, but we have to verify this because Congress, and we have to get ratification. And the Soviets at the beginning, there was also some kind of understanding there. But in 78, for example, as the Americans came like every day with a new kind of, okay, this detail, we need this, because verification. Every day the Soviets became suspicious and thought, at the beginning we thought, okay, we want to come to your side and help you to get the ratification, we work together. But if this comes every day, like this detail, this, we need this because of Congress, we don't, these neocons, and we're under pressure, they began to get, suspicious. So that's kind of a interesting asymmetry, and raises bigger questions about democracies and foreign policy and towards dictatorships. The other point, the technology, I think that's really important, how technology, I think in my paper that's one of the main things I found interesting, like that technology is rhetorically some kind of way to get a backdoor from all the problems of the nuclear dilemma and the nuclear problems, to say we have technology now, and we can even superiority we can use now because we have this surveillance abilities now. We can use technology to get rid of all the problems of the nuclear age. So, but then the question is, and I think that's for the contemporaries a big thing: is technology good or bad? Because somebody like Paul Nitze would say, no, it isn't good or bad. It's just there, and you can use it for good things and bad things. But other people would, and you see this in the MIRF questions about what Deborah did write an interesting piece in her paper. Is MIRF like this kind of destabilizing qualitative factor for the nuclear arms race. Is this good or bad? Is this something both should be controlled? And there's a lot of controversy about this. If this was a missed opportunity for like humankind to control this factor, is it just because Paul Nitze would say to this if he was still alive, like, no, it's not bad. I mean, if we could have used it against the Soviets for superiority, it's a good thing. Yeah, so that's the reason why we stuck to it and tried to use it. But this plan didn't work out.
The other authors? Yeah.
Yeah, just a point on the technology, which I think is really, really interesting. But I think that no matter how advanced the technology, there's always the perception that there is no effective 100% verification, right? That if someone wants to cheat, that they will somehow do it. And I'm just thinking kind of in a wider range about like the IAEA report yesterday on Iran, and also the fact about with the problems of kind of the dual use nature of nuclear technology. So kind of in a wider range that, you know, you need to not only look at the technology, but at motivations. So technology advances in, let's say, verification technology, while incredibly important, I think will never kind of, you can't get rid of the doubt that if someone wants to cheat, that they will do it somehow as well.
Yeah, Matthew, Michael, the verification measures for the SALT I treaty was satellites, national technical means, and the same thing in SALT II, I believe. And so on-site inspections was added. We had the technology. We had the technology already, and on-site inspections were added for the INF Treaty, START Treaty, CFE Treaty, and subsequent treaties there. I myself went on an inspection in September 1987. 1988. I went to a military base which had no markings whatsoever on the highway. I mean, you just literally went to a road and turned off to the left and went a couple of kilometers, and there was a missile base there for the destruction of SS-23 missiles. I was there for 32 days. Our 10-person inspection team was allowed one telephone call per week, and that was it. There were no messages. And that could only be to the U.S. Embassy. And the destruction of the SS-23s was delayed, so we had to be there another 10 days, which meant all of our airlines had to be changed and so on. So we actually ended up going to Moscow, changing them and so on, of which our Soviet officer escort told us that this was almost impossible in the Soviet Union, that they would have to go to Gorbachev to get approval to get 10 tickets changed. So we all laughed and had a coffee over there. But the difference in the societies was enormous and so on.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up on the conversation between Deborah and Nick and Arvid on the about the role of personal trust again between leaders, among leaders. I'm not sure that people, although Deborah in her great keynote yesterday gave an example, I think if I remember correctly, about Khrushchev talking about Eisenhower as a great-grandfather, but maybe not as a great leader. So where these two roles were actually split up. I'm not so sure to what degree this actually holds true, because all these people know that they're not meeting, because they love to play bridge or bocce or whatever, but that they meet in their capacity, in their role as world leaders, and that's why they get together. So this dimension, or I wouldn't call it a dimension, this kind of characteristic, this major defining characteristic of these meetings is never being lost. But what does matter? So they meet in as role takers, so to speak, or role bearers. But at the same time, the personal factor comes in where over a long stretch of time, and I think time is really important here. People make sure, or these negotiators make sure that there are certain motives or principles that the other person, the other leader embodies, and that he's not just there as the kind of embodiment of the power structure, the power nexus in the US or in the USSR, but that there is a kind of a personal, I don't know, mission or fever or reason to be there and to carry through with the agenda. So to this extent, personalities and the ability to convey a certain urgency, a certain dedication, personal dedication to what we are here to do, rescue the world, or kind of make the world safer for our children and grandchildren, whatever it is, try to grapple with climate change. If there is a personal urgency behind it, this lends, I think, credibility to and prepares for trusting relations to develop between these leaders. So in this regard, I do think personal characteristics, or I stick to this sense of urgency, really matters to the credibility of leaders. My question actually is about, and that mainly goes to Arvid and to all of you, actually, to all of you. I wonder, talking about technology, talking about verification processes, to what degree deception is actually built into the process. So, and just from, again, perspective taking on both sides, the Americans probably did not disclose all their secrets to the Soviets. And they knew that. And they expected that, well, because they knew what they themselves were doing, they probably expected the Soviets to do the same. So you going on these inspections and doing all this verification probably meant being aware of a lot of window dressing on all sides. Was there a point, though, when or a kind of tipping point when you became aware that, okay, deception, window dressing is okay, but only to a certain point, and then the whole picture changes? Because verification is not, I don't personally believe that it can be taken at face value. I mean, everybody knew that everybody else was kind of cheating. You had your intelligence reports about some kind of secret things being not shared with you. Or am I too suspicious here?
Well, the treaty is about reducing weapons. The INF Treaty is counting the 1,700 weapons that they said that they had that were intermediate range weapons. And they're specific weapons. They're the SS-20s, SS-23s, and so on. And the Americans put in their cruise missiles and their Pershing missiles. And so there's specific weapons that are going to be identified as those weapon systems, and then they're going to be cut up. And they were all cut up, and so on. And that's it. They had no right to go and look at tanks that were at this base. They had no right to go look at submarines that might be at this. In fact, none of the naval parts were in this particular treaty, and so on. So I don't think the deception was there. I mean, everybody assumed that these were huge militaries on both sides, and that you would not be able to go to a naval submarine base and inspect, because it just wasn't in the treaty. It is in the START Treaty, and so on. But even that's limited. You can't go to military training sites and look at what's going on in training sites. These are very specific, limited treaties. And that's one of the things the two leaders who implemented the treaty tried to get across to their inspection teams, that you are not a tourist. You're not there to report on everything that you see. Only specifically is the treaty in effect. One curious story: once once the Soviet Union collapses in December of 1991, the arms control inspections went on for another seven or 8 years under this particular treaty, and we had a team that was in. It was in one of the nations, Estonia, I believe, and they went to an area that was a remote in the forest depot, and there were huge mounds where weapons had been kept and so on, and there were no INF vehicles there, but there were like 35 Volvos, and and they had been stolen in Western Europe and brought to this place and so on. And we asked the question, "What are these?" And they said, "These are not treaty items." But these things are specific, limited treaties. They are not broad treaties, and so on.
I think on the deception point, as Laura was saying, I mean, no verification system can give you certainty,
right?
And this is where I think it does get tricky. In fact, let me throw it back to you, because I'm not sure how your concept of trust can deal with this, actually, because when you sign a treaty, if you accept that there's no certainty, there's no 100% guarantee, then you are relying on a measure of trust. But that measure of trust isn't coming out. I mean, I suppose it's conceivable that you could have that measure of trust coming out of some interpersonal relationship that leads you to think that you can trust the other side. But if you come back to or trust the interlocutor you're dealing with, to be more precise, if you come back to my future uncertainty problem, you don't know whether that leader's going to be there in 1 year or 2 years or 3 years' time. But this treaty might be running for 10, 15, 20, 25 years, particularly with disarmament, nuclear disarmament. If we move into a significant phase of nuclear disarmament in the next 1 to 2 decades, then that's going to be a long process. And it's going to span way beyond 1 or even 2 presidential cycles. So the idea that the trust could be interpersonal, that was providing the basis for those kind of agreements, I think is problematic. It would have to be more than that. And yet, and this is what I think this is a challenge for your conception of trust, because it would have to, in some sense, be one in which people could say, well, we are confident that this trust will continue, because we know the verification machinery we've got, and as we move closer to zero, if that happens, zero nuclear weapons, the verification demands are going to get greater and greater, and even though we may get more intrusive mechanisms, there will still be the need for, as Laura was saying, there will still be the need for that initial moment of trust, where you say, okay, even though we can't have certainty, we are prepared to live with the uncertainty. So that's where deception comes in, because the risk, of course, is that you will get deceived in that space and that your trust will be taken advantage of. And if you look at the Iranian situation, the agency, has struggled all these years since the disclosures to find out more and more information. But still, as the report made clear yesterday, there's still lots of things that remain very unclear. And that's, I think that the Iranian case is a really good example of this, of how no verification system, no level of intrusiveness can get you over that problem of needing to have a certain move of trust.
I want to just stress 2 points, because on the one hand, I think it's really important to keep in mind that, like on the Soviet side, the military didn't know about their nuclear weapons, but the diplomats didn't know anything. And that's really like a striking thing for the whole negotiations, because at the SALT negotiation, the first thing what was happening there was that the Americans wanted to talk about all these weapons, say, okay, you have 1,300 or something. And Semyonov stood up and said, wait a minute. They went out and said, okay, our diplomats doesn't know about this stuff, and they have no classification for this. So these, you have to think about this, is really astonishing, and how this worked then. And there started and this was all the time, this was the case. Even Dobrynin, who did a lot for a diplomat, had some problems with this, because he didn't know all the stuff. Kissinger came to him and said, this rocket, and he had really problems to get his contacts in the military then started. So this was really shaping the negotiation all the time. And there was, and also leading to strange coalition building, for example, between the militaries of both sides against the both diplomats, because they were like the peaceniks on both sides, like the people who wanted to have arms control against the militaries who could agree on both sides to say, okay, we don't like this process, probably we get it somewhere on the table. But this started in some way a process on the Soviet side to think about this, because it didn't work at all, and it stayed this way till the end of the negotiations. But step by step, a little bit, they had to do something like changing a little bit that the diplomats knew more. So that's just this. And the second thing I wanted to stress is, I have this only shortly in my paper. There was the SCC, the Standing Consultative Commission. It was there to verify the implementation of the treaty. And I think I want to try to work about this more, but that's a really interesting kind of forum, because there the military experts were talking about implementation. And I think this process worked, especially this SCC was still there even in the Second Cold War. It wasn't abolished.
But it was politicized. It was really politicized.
It was politicized. But the thing is, I did see last week in the Reagan Library the NSC meeting about the first meeting of the SCC under Reagan. And the point is there that Reagan says, like, okay, can we get rid of this kind of forum? Because we are against SALT II, are we? Yeah. And interestingly, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff said, Mr. President, that's a quite useful forum. And that's interesting, because the military is really, these are the last people who would say, like, arms control is any good. But he really, like, in the like SALT II discussion and these, okay, there you have to differentiate between who is military and on which side, but generally. And that's kind of interesting to see this kind of, so that in the SCC, there developed really something like a working relationship, and there was not so much window dressing there or something like this. And this was useful even for the experts of the both sides, and they had to sell this to the new administration in a way.
Can I just come back to you? How would you deal with that, the argument that the policymakers have got a 15, 20-year time horizon? They want to move towards very small numbers of nuclear weapons, and they know that they're going to be relying on there's a gap between what they can verify and what they can know the other side's actually doing. Doesn't trust fill that gap?
When you ask me directly, I try to respond directly. I'm not convinced that you need trust here, because as these treaties and the verification process are step-by-step procedures that go on, as you've been describing, for quite a number of years, there's always the chance, when you feel deceived and when you feel that the other side is not playing it, according to the rules that were established in the treaty, you can always refrain from it. You can drop out. You can stop the procedures, and that's a far more, probably a far more relevant threat to the other side than saying, well, you deceived my trust, and I thought you were trustworthy, and now you're not. I'm not really convinced yet that you need the category here in order to fill this gap. It's about, you set up a treaty and you verify that it's been met by all participants, either by a third agency or by a mutual by mutual control committees. So where is trust here?
Because you can never have 100% guarantee that the other party is complying.
Okay, but that's what
you don't know
you
whether
have.
there's a parallel program inside Iran or not.
Yeah, but
the evidence is pointing increasingly to the fact that it looks like there probably was one.
Yeah, but then it's about keeping the suspicions and keeping keeping sound guesses about the other's motives alive, and trying to find mechanisms to deal with these suspicions. It's not about trust.
What actually happens, Uta, is we know that the Soviet Union collapses, and we know that 15 new nations are come out of that collapse. But what we don't recognize is that Russia had the largest military in the world, and it was far larger than the Russian leaders felt was necessary. And these treaties were used as a way of reducing weapons to take pressures off of the economic situation in the government, the budget situation. Your point earlier about the use of time on these accumulating experience, the general that was in charge of the INF treaty verification, he retired in 1991. In 1994, he was asked to come back and head a special commission to formulate cooperative reduction policies with Russia and Ukraine and other nations. He had a series of meetings with Colonel General Maslin. Maslin was head of the 12th Main Directorate in the Russian General Staff. He was the owner of all nuclear weapons in Russia, some 30, maybe 15,000 at this time. Nobody knows exactly what the number was. But they worked out procedures whereby the U.S. government, which had this program to assist them in the reduction of their weapons, to build a very large new plant, some $400 million plant at Mayak to eliminate the nuclear material in the weapons, and they are doing that now. They also produced, not produced, but they reached agreements and so on, largely through experience of trust. They just literally trusted each other to ship train loads, 75 separate train loads a year for like 5 years from the operational weapon sites down to this plant to eliminate the weapons. And then they began to talk about security. Under the Soviet Union, they had over 125 nuclear weapons depots where they stored weapons and so on. U.S. has less than 20. Actually, we have less than 15. And they didn't want to talk about this. They just said, these are our responsibility. This is our security. We will take care of this. So we decided we would bring in experts to tell them how we did it, how the United States did it. And this is the kind of security we have. We have triple-level fences. We have television cameras. We have lights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And pretty soon they began to ask for money for building fences and for lights and so on. And we suggested that it would not be efficient to have 125 sites in the future. And they agreed. They said, okay, well, just give us the money and we will buy them for our sites. And we said, no, U.S. contracting laws requires us to send contractors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We must have a report and so on. Anyway, they came down to about 30, and then they came down to about 20, which is where they are today, and so on. But it's all based upon this relationship between these two men who were there for about 7 years working out these issues. And so instead of deception, it's the other way. It's cooperation and that. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we have reached about the end of the allotted time. I would like to thank all the panelists, and maybe this time we can give them a round of applause.